Welcome once again to I've Got Mail, and this is probably the last one that I'm going to do for a little while, but we're coming up on elections, and so I wanted to share with you one of the very, very many flyers that I've been getting. Most of them are pretty much what we've been going over in previous videos, but this one was kind of unique, and it has to do with the American Rescue Plan. And it's from, paid for by One Nation. In case you're wondering, we'll just go to the One Nation organization right here and see what their website says. Out of many one, that was the founder's vision for America, a nation forged from different cultures, countries, creeds, and classes, yet unified by a common commitment of freedom, democratic governance, and guaranteed individual rights. His strongest voice in our country comes not from political leaders or media figures, but its citizens. One Nation aims to tap that voice and amplify it through cutting-edge technology, public opinion research, and grassroots-level advocacy. By forming consensus on critical issues, One Nation seeks to build momentum for constructive policy changes in Washington that expand freedom, promote innovation, and broaden economic prosperity. Also, defending the courts is an issue for them, as America's last line of defense against unconstitutional legislation and executive action. The judicial branch must administer justice fairly and impartially. This is why One Nation supports the appointment of constitutional conservatives to the bench, like Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, who will interpret the law as it is written. Oh. Okay. To their credit, they also made a point of, saying supporting victims of sexual assault is a big issue. But restraining spending. This seems to be the big one that we're going to be focused on today, and that's why I wanted to make mention of who this organization was before we get into this. Our government has a spending problem. Years of out-of-control spending and poor decision-making has led us to where we are today, over $22 trillion in debt, with another $1 million being irresponsibly spent every 30 seconds. Now, I do find it interesting that even though this seems to be a relatively conservative organization that liked Gorsuch and Kavanaugh to the bench to interpret the law correctly, that they do make a specific mention that in 2018, during the Trump administration, and while he had a Republican Congress and Senate, the federal government spent $4.1 trillion, racking up a deficit of $779 billion. Interest payments on the debt alone accounted for 8%, $325 billion of spending. The government has not recorded a budget surplus since 2001, 18 years ago. By the way, I'm not a big fan of the Clintons, but I do think it's important to make note that the budget surplus happened under the Clinton administration. So there's that. Anyway, all of that might explain why they sent this out and why. Washington, D.C. liberals and Senator Maggie Hassan voted to allow millions of your tax-funded COVID relief to be wasted. Now, when they get inside, there's a pop-out. And here's the thing. I just love the fact that they took the time to make, an actual pop-out. Look at this. That's work. That is quality work. I really appreciate this. Let me see if I can explain what's in here. So basically, they're complaining about different things that have had money go to them. And we'll get into a couple of those. I don't really want to go through this in real detail because getting deep in the weeds leads to those 1-hour videos that I don't want to really do. But anyways, they're saying $2 million for a private ski area in Iowa, $15 million to upgrade a soccer stadium in New Jersey, $140 million for a luxury resort and spa in Florida. Before anyone says anything, thinking that it might be Mar-a-Lago, I did kind of look this up, and I'll tell you about it in a minute. It's not Mar-a-Lago. I thought it might be Mar-a-Lago, and they're trying to be very catty about it, but no. $60 million to pay off debt for the city of San Francisco. And basically, they're asking Senator Hassan to support 3485, the Inflation Prevention Act, to stop inflation. This is different than the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed already. This is one that's being introduced and co-sponsored by Republicans. Now, you might be asking yourself, what exactly is that? And we're going to get to that, but first, let's talk a little bit about a couple of those issues. So let's talk about that $140 million piece. Now, I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this, to be honest with you, because again, don't want a really long video, but I wanted to make note, this is from Local 10 News in Florida, and it says, Broward County, Florida, the Broward County Commissioners allocated about $140 million, that's what they're talking about in the thing, of federal relief funds related to the coronavirus pandemic to build a new 29-story luxury hotel. The funds for the 800-room hotel come from the $350 billion American Rescue Plan, also known as the COVID-19 Relief Package. Now, this is where things get a little tricky, because over the course of the last few years, we've had multiple stimulus packages, right? In fact, when I looked up the COVID relief package, one of the first things that came up was from the New York Post, so take that for what it is, but reminding me that President Trump had signed in December of 2020 a $2.3 trillion COVID-19 relief and government funding bill that includes $600 stimulus checks for most Americans. Trump signed it several days after saying the legislation was a disgrace and calling on Congress to up the relief payments to $2,000 and scale back spending. While the president insisted he would send Congress a redlined version with items to be removed under the rescission process, those are merely suggestions to Congress. The bill as signed would not necessarily be changed. Therefore, a family of four would receive $5,200, the president said about the increase, which would require Republican approval. I like how I have his hair just like sentient by itself down there. Now, the interesting thing I find about this is that Republicans were recently trying to dunk on the Democrats for the idea that people took in $4,200 or something less, had a higher debt of like $4,200 than in previous years. And I'm like, well, but we didn't have this year where they got that $5,200 payment for the family of four. So, doesn't that affect it? Like, doesn't the fact that people weren't getting those checks have something to do with the fact that they weren't getting as much money? I feel like those two things are related. Back to Local 10, though, the hotel was among the projects the Associated Press identified as spending disasters because of permissive Treasury Department rules. Liz Bourgeois, a spokeswoman for the Treasury Department, told the Associated Press the funds are meant to help local governments to recover from financial distress and achieve their own strategies for restoring jobs. The big one here was that $600 million to pay off debt for the city of San Francisco. I want to put that in context, because that's not a wholly false statement, but going to PolitiFact, they wrote about this. No. Federal relief dollars for San Francisco won't pay for pot, alcohol for homeless. In a hurry, San Francisco spent about $1,500 per month on physician-prescribed alcohol for some homeless people it kept isolated in hotels during the pandemic. The program is slated to end in June. No tax dollars were spent on marijuana. The reason why they had to say this was because Kevin McCarthy, right here, had said, did you know Nancy Pelosi's Bay Area bailout included $600 million for San Francisco? Part of which goes to cover the tab for free alcohol and marijuana for the homeless. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. This bailout is too costly, corrupt, and liberal. Now, to put this into context, city officials say the American Rescue Plan Act, which contains $360 billion in aid to state and federal governments, will send San Francisco about $600 million over the next 2 years. The city can decide how to spend the money to help recover from damage wrought by the pandemic. I mean, $600 million does seem like a lot, but in context of the $360 billion of aid to state and local governments, that's not a lot. Like, that obviously got spread around a bit. So that got me to thinking about how this is all delineated out. And so I looked it up, and one of the first articles that comes up is from Vox, So now that Biden is president and Democrats control the Senate, they finally have the power to achieve this long-time goal. The $350 billion included in the stimulus bill that passed the House is divided in the following way. State governments in Washington, D.C., $195.3 billion. Each state and D.C. would get $500 million, and the remaining $169 billion is divided up according to each state's share of national unemployed workers. DC's government would also get $755 million that Democrats say it should have gotten in last year's stimulus. Republicans insisted then on treating DC as a territory, not a state. Yes, because remember, we're now talking about a different stimulus than the original stimulus. Local governments, $130.2 billion. Half of this goes to cities and half to counties. The city money would be divided according to the Community Development Block Grant formula, and the county money would be given out according to population. The House bill also contains $20 billion given to federally recognized tribal governments and $4.5 billion to U.S. territories, but keep in mind that none of this is final. All the details are subject to change as the bill moved to the Senate. Come to think of it, I don't actually know what the finalized bill was. It was smaller than what was in here. So when we say $600 million to pay off San Francisco's debt over the next 2 years, part of that probably would have come from the state allocation, but then also to the city's part of that. I'm not going to get into the rest of this because, again, I don't want a really long video. But I wanted to just see if any of this had any water whatsoever. And it is relatively accurate, maybe not completely truthful, but yes, money did get spent, and a lot of it in cities. So take that for what you will. Not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing. Most people live in cities. So it kind of makes sense that that would happen. And I will also note, just in case anyone's wondering, is that if you're doing this to, like, build a spa or upgrade a stadium, that creates jobs. You know, jobs that everybody keeps saying we need more of? Which, I don't know, the unemployment rate is like 3% right now. I don't really know how much more we have to hammer that home. But anyway, so I wanted to know a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act, and so I went to govtrack.us. Again, it's like the first one that pops up with some basic information about what this is. And this is where I start to get some questions. Okay, so they start with a fun little jape here. The difference between Tom Brady and Joe Biden: with Tom Brady, you never have to worry about inflation. You see, because of the Deflategate thing? Yeah, cool. Anyway, so current U.S. inflation rate is 7.04%, or the level at which prices of goods and services have increased over the preceding 12 months. That's the highest rate since June 1982. That was a good month. Multiple simultaneous factors are contributing to that statistic, including supply chain snags, a shortage of truck drivers, and wages increasing in 2021 at the highest rate since 1983. The thing is, when it's framed that way, wages increasing at the highest rate since 1983 is a good thing. It's been stagnating for a very long time. It's been like 12, 13 years since the minimum wage increased in the country. Meanwhile, property values, rent prices, and everything else have gone up. Every time I start hearing people say that we shouldn't raise the minimum wage because it's going to raise the price of stuff, I keep thinking to myself, but the price of stuff rises anyway. It's just that people don't have the kind of resources to pay for them. So if a lot of this is based on wages going up, that at least means people have a better opportunity to pay for them. When it comes to the supply chain or shortage of truck drivers, the thing I initially think of is that those seem like infrastructure problems. And how would we improve the infrastructure unless we spend money to improve the infrastructure? I don't know how else you think we're going to do it. But critics of higher government spending say that another major factor is federal government spending. In fiscal year 2021, federal spending soared to approximately $7.2 trillion, or about 16.7% of GDP. The latter number marked a new all-time record outside of wartime, which I think is an interesting way of phrasing that, just because there are very few times where America is not in wartime. But finally, what the legislation does. Great. The Inflation Prevention Act would disallow Congress from enacting legislation that would increase inflation until the annual inflation rate drops below 4.5%. That inflation determination would be according to the official financial estimate from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. That could potentially be very soon. The Federal Reserve currently predicts that inflation will fall to 2.6% by December 2022, while falling below that 4.5% threshold months prior. So it does nothing? This is fun. We can actually look through all of this, like the inflation month on month. Wow, 2015, we had like 0.1% average inflation. I wonder who was in office then. 2009, negative 0.4 inflation. We had non-inflation. Well, alright, so we had like a 9.1 in June, and it's falling. You don't have October ready yet. Supporters argue that Congress's spending was a major factor that got inflation into this mess, so it's on Congress to help get it out of it as well. Opponents say that government spending levels contribute minimally to the current 40-year inflation high, citing mostly, if you read the article, to price gouging by companies using the idea of price increases to justify going over and above. One of those places was with like groceries. They were looking at a few grocery stores and they were finding that the increase in price that they were doing on their products was more than what the inflation rate was. There was also the massive amount of money that like gas companies were getting in relation to what the pricing was. So if you have like a 300% increase in your profit margin than in normal years, boy, that seems like somebody's unrealistically increasing what stuff costs. Okay, I am on too many tangents. So, the bill. It's right here. This is the actual congress.gov. I can't give you a better source of information for what's in the bill than this. Section 1. This act may be cited as the Inflation Prevention Act. Point of order. In general, in the Senate, it shall not be in order to consider a provision in a bill, joint resolution, motion, amendment between the houses, or conference report that provides new budgetary authority, and that is estimated to result in an increase in the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers as published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, unless the annualized rate of increase in the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers most recently published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics is not more than 4.5%. You just know that the second they want to buy some tanks, this goes right out the window, right? Like, the second they say, man, it would be really sweet if we had a new plane with some flames down the side. However, I honestly don't know if their claim that government spending leads to inflation is an accurate one. And the reason why I say that is because of this little nugget of information that has to do with the tax cuts that were passed back in 2018. So, from a piece by Politico by David Rogers in February of 2018, between new cost estimates and the White House's own budget numbers, the wheels are coming off Republican claims that President Donald Trump's tax cuts will pay for themselves by generating increased growth and government revenues over the next decade. Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin famously boasted in September, but his own department's analysts now peg the 10-year cost at $2.3 trillion, given the administration's assumption that tax breaks for individuals and large estates will be extended past 2025. Politico's own calculations, working entirely from data in the 2018 and 2019 budgets, indicate that the added revenues generated by the tax cuts themselves would fall substantially short of matching $2.3 trillion. For the years 2018 to 2027, the shortfall ranges from $1 trillion to $1.3 trillion. In measuring for 2019 to 2028, the picture improves, but the 10-year shortfall still is between $700 billion and $1.1 trillion. Using the same approach, Politico found the administration could reap extra revenue of $2.3 trillion by 2028 if the economy lives up to the assumed 3% average annual growth in the president's budget, a full 0.8 percentage point increase over the White House's starting baseline. Note that when 2020 came along, that idea of 3% annual growth kind of took a hit. So that was the Trump tax cuts of 2018. And it was over $2 trillion in spending that we would have to do in order to make those tax cuts stick. So, did that increase inflation in 2018? Well, here's 2018 inflation numbers. Not a single one above 3%, averaging at 2.4%. The year after those tax cuts, again, we're not even looking at much above 2, with an average inflation of 1.8 at the end of the year. That was the government spending trillions of dollars on tax cuts. And then in 2020, the inflation numbers, as you can see, are really low. The country was shut down for the bulk of that year. I guess if people are really that worried about inflation, we could just shut the country down again. That seemed to work pretty well on making inflation go away, because those were pretty low numbers by comparison. So February of 2018 is when the tax cuts are starting. And over the year prior, you might see about a 1% drop, increase over what it was previously. And then the year after that, back down to what it was before. But I wanted to hit on this thing that I mentioned earlier from Steve Mnuchin. Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt. This is a chart that was put together by thebalancemoney.com. And what we have is end of fiscal year, the debt in billions rounded, the debt to GDP ratio, and major events by presidential term. Now, I always get confused by how they calculate or what the percentage for debt to GDP ratio is, but I think lower percentages are better, at least in traditional thinking, because the idea is that your GDP should always be more than what your debt is, although there is some debate about whether that's an accurate figure to determine the health of the economy. I just think it's interesting that in 1929, we had $17 billion in debt. We already had, pretty good debt, and then the market crashed. Debt seemed to go up pretty significantly in 41 when we entered World War I. Over just a couple years, we went from $49 billion in debt to $137 billion in debt. We hit the trillion mark in 1982. Reagan increased spending. Jobless rate ended up at 10.8% in 83, so you can see that seems to really increase. We hit $2 trillion when Reagan lowered taxes, kind of showing that the tax cuts don't necessarily pay down debt. 1990, the national debt hits $3 trillion during the first Iraq War. 1992, we hit $4 trillion. 96, we hit 5. 2002, we hit the $6 trillion mark during the War on Terror. 2018, we hit the $10 trillion mark during the bank bailouts. 2018, Trump tax cuts. We were at $21 trillion. The following year, 2019, national debt was at $22.7 trillion. Of course, we were in the trade wars by that point, so national debt rocketed up again in 2020 during COVID-19 and the recession. to $27 trillion, and in 2022, we're looking at 30. Actually, when you start to think about it, compared to how high the debt increases were year on year, the fact that we've only actually increased about $3 trillion in national debt in the last 2 years is kind of impressive. I mean, from 2019 to 2020, we saw like $5 trillion in new debt, and we've had 3 in 2 years past that. So the point of the matter is that the tax cuts that cost a lot of money, mind you, 1, didn't really seem to pay down debt, and 2, didn't really affect inflation rates. Now, I don't know everything, but I do think that there is a bit of simplicity in saying that just stopping the government from spending money will make inflation go down, because there seems to be a lot more factors than just that. And in many of the things that we're talking about contributing to inflation rates, it would seem that more infrastructure spending, like when it comes to a lack of truck drivers or supply chain issues, infrastructure spending would help alleviate those factors, not increase them. And again, that does assume that your government is going to spend money wisely, and I can totally understand why people might have reservations about that, but the general notion that you want to do infrastructure spending, or that we want to be better at infrastructure in general, should technically be a net good, not just for inflation rates, but for you and me. If I don't do another video before Election Day, I do still want to encourage everyone to go out and vote for the midterm election. This is one of the more important ones that we've ever had at this juncture. And please, please, make sure that you are voting with the state and local officials in mind as well. And please do a little research on them before you pick them. I watched a video not too long ago, and it was from the New York Times. Johnny Harris was talking about a threat to American democracy. I'll try to link it in the description down below, where he was talking about how there is the possibility of re-rigging the entire system through state and local government officials. And you are going to be scared if you go and watch that. So please, just be mindful that at every level of government, there are people pulling levers, and sometimes the smallest of levers are the most important. Your prophecy for the day, in the future, cities will just receive money based on how many songs were written about them. That seems like a fair metric.